Thanks everybody for coming. So we're going to continue on in 2 Peter. We just got an introduction to 2 Peter yesterday, and tonight we'll get started. We're just going to start with chapter 1, verses 2 through 9 tonight, are our verses to dig into. There's plenty in them, though. So we can get started with a little review. The only review I have is the one verse we looked at already for 2 Peter, which is verse 1. Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have received a faith of the same kind as ours, by the righteousness of our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. So the things we looked at in this verse, for one, the author identifies himself. It's Peter. Also, we have identified the audience. 1 Peter was directed to a number of specific areas, churches in Asia Minor. This is pretty general. To those who have received a faith of the same kind as ours. All Christians is this audience. So it's a little more general an audience for this one. And the word ours is interesting. Most attribute that to being the apostles. You know, the same kind as ours. I believe Peter is talking about us apostles as ours. All right, we can go into the first group of verses here. If I could have a reader for 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. I have no American Standard on the board, but you can read from whatever version you like. French, I did see you first.
You saw somebody else? Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Nathan, take it.
Grace to you and peace be multiplied in the knowledge of God and Jesus our Lord, seeing that his divine power hath granted us unto all things that pertain unto life and godliness, excuse me, through the knowledge of him that called us by his own glory and virtue, whereby he hath granted us his precious and exceeding great promises, that through these ye may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world by lust.
Thank you for the reading. All right, so right away I see one of the themes start to show up in 2 Peter. Verses 2 and 3 both have the word knowledge in it, for one. I found that interesting because we see that the grace and the peace come from our knowledge of God and Jesus Christ. And then also, again, his power grants us everything in life and godliness through the knowledge that we have in him. So specifically the true knowledge, so not the worldly or other knowledge, the true knowledge, the knowledge of God and of Jesus Christ. And so already we see there's an interesting direction at the importance of what our knowledge is, our understanding of God and what it can do for us as Christians. It's highly important, and it's not something we should ever overlook. The knowledge, of course, can be applied, just as important, but it all has to start with the knowledge of God. I gave a whole lesson on wisdom once, and the true knowledge that comes from having a proper relationship with God, having a proper fear of God. And so in these first few verses, the book pointed this out, that Peter separates life and godliness in this verse. And the book points out, it's interesting that those are separate things, so why do you think Peter does this? Why does Peter separate life and godliness when he says his power has granted us everything pertaining to life and godliness? For that matter, why doesn't he just say life? I mean, life covers it all, right? Anybody with thoughts on why he would separate them? Kind of a hard question, yeah.
The first thing that comes to my mind as I read this true knowledge and life and God, pertaining to life and godliness and all that, is that when Peter was a new disciple and apostle, he didn't have the true knowledge of what Christ's ministry really was. It was not. He thought that this was going to be a military takeover of the Romans and free
Right.
the people of God from Roman rule.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't have a true knowledge true knowledge of what was really going on with his life and with himself as a disciple of Christ.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, that Peter would have that understanding, because Peter had a life without knowledge of God. Peter had a life without godliness, or at least it was certainly without Jesus Christ for a long time, and he knew what that life was. So certainly he's aware that you can live a life without godliness. It's possible. And so maybe that's why he adds, there is everything pertaining to life and godliness. Godliness is it's an important part of it. Yeah, other thoughts on why he lists them both? David?
I like to read it again
Mm-hmm.
within the context of the world in which he's saved.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this letter. I think it points out some things. Peter helps us to understand some things, but that we can keep ourselves even now being deceived by the deceit. At the time he was done, especially the way he talks about it, the way he addresses it, to those of like precious faith. So it's addressed to people who have now put their faith in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't appear in this letter that he's talking Jews or Gentiles or whatever. He's talking about those, whether you're Jew or Gentile, unless there's some other indication in the letter that I haven't picked up on. Those who have like precious faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's key in understanding what he's got to say. Now, in the world in which he was growing up in, yes, he lived under the law. But the Greeks believed all manner of things, and lies and things, and whatever that Satan could put in their head to believe in mystery.
Yeah.
But now through Jesus and the knowledge that Jesus has provided, we can now, those who have like precious faith, can come to know God, and now they can have life, real life,
Yeah.
not just animation of the physical flesh. God already provided that for everything. What is necessary to keep our bodies alive. And that is revealed through the gospel as well to the Gentile world, how all things were created. But now, true life. Now, what I would do, I like to take, when you say life, I will now point to 1 John.
Mm-hmm.
Because 1 John tells us what life really is, what true life is, and godliness, God-likeness. So I can now have, through Jesus, true life, eternal. And I can be like God, in that of the same nature as God. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah, and one of the important things about that you said is it's life and godliness. Like yes, it's two separate words, but there is one of the important things about them is that they are relating to each other and they are working together, right? Like it's not, well, I have godliness at church and then I have my life outside of church. It's they're working together to have this closeness to God. John.
And, sometimes the Greeks put together a long list of synonyms just to emphasize the importance, rather than people trying to make a distinction. But I think here there really is a distinction, because if you look at the Greek words being used, the idea of life here is vitality, full life, a complete life.
Mm-hmm.
The word used and translated as godliness means a respect or reverence toward God.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those two are not really synonyms, but they do go together.
Yeah. Yeah, and the important way that they work together. So yeah, it is a really interesting way to look at it. And these themes are important to discuss now because they're going to come up more and more, is that there's these, how they work together, our full life and our full godliness, and how they make us complete as Christians. Yeah, other thoughts on that? French?
How about a different sense?
question I want to ask. Okay, the last sentence in that, when it's talking about partakers of the divine nature.
Okay.
Having escaped the corruption that is in this world.
Yeah.
Us. Do not also not be saying that is in this world by greed, that is what's causing the corruption?
Say that last part again.
Could, instead of using the word lust, could it not also, would it not fit in if he's saying that is in this world by greed that is causing all this corruption?
Now that's interesting because I did think about that and I didn't have, I don't have a ton to give you, to offer you on that, but I really did think about why lust, the corruption that is in this world by lust. And, I looked at that to see, are there alternate translations? It's all pretty similar. It's lust. And I think what they're going for, and this is just, a little bit of my impression, what I think is meant by the lust there, lust is more than just like want or need. It's, this full commitment through, it's like a compulsive commitment. It's not always even voluntary. It's you've given in to this compulsion commitment to, I think, all those other things that you could put here. Greed, say. And so I think that's why it's the word lust. Because here we're talking about, choosing to become a partaker of the divine nature, and then there's another way you can go. Committing yourself to this lust, this compelled want of all things ungodly, say. It's my thoughts on why the word lust is there. Anyone else have thoughts on why the word lust is there? It's an interesting thought. Yeah, Nathan.
The English Standard Version, which I just use primarily just for referencing and things of that nature, but I don't mind that translation. But it uses the phrase there that is in the world because of sinful desire.
Ah, okay.
And so lust is a word that we all know. It's a biblical word, of course, even as we know as well. But I think it emphasizes that strong temptation, that strong desire, for whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And yes, I believe that you could fill in the blank there with whatever that you are lusting after. Whether it is money or whether it is something else that someone else has or whatever the case may be. I think it's just emphasizing the strong desire, that strong temptation, to be overcome, with whatever it is.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, other thoughts on that? Yeah, David.
It's pretty much an overwhelming, I guess, maybe a higher level description of covetousness.
Okay, yeah.
Same sense. I mean, it's the whole point, the source of it is when the flesh gets to the point where it's just got to have whatever it wants,
Mm-hmm.
and it will do anything to get it,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. Lie, steal, cheat, murder, whatever. That's because of that right there, it will result in evil towards other people. And it's an attitude of it results from not knowing God. See, again, you can go back to the Genesis myth. That very moment when they decided that God was a liar and the serpent was telling them the truth. What was it that got him to do it? He appealed to their lust or something inside of them that he put in there, a lie, what resulted in them obeying him rather than God.
Mm-hmm.
That was the problem. And if they wanted, what is it? They wanted to know the knowledge of good and evil, as if somehow knowing that was going to make life so much better and it could be just like God. But what he's saying here is you can be like God, but not the way of the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely different route, and there's only one way to it. It's through obedience to God, which they did not do.
Right. And when you say what he's saying is you can be like God, do you mean that part where he says partakers of the divine nature? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I found that to be very interesting that he uses those words, partakers of the divine nature.
What did he
Yeah.
tell them? Be like, give, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's
Mhm.
thirsty, give him a drink. What's he telling them? Be like your Father in heaven,
Mhm.
because he sends the rain and sunshine even on the unrighteous.
Yeah, and partakers of the divine nature, it's, again, going to the translation a little bit, is, I read about this, and the partakers part, it does translate a little better as a word like fellowship or sharing. It's not so much some people read this and they get a little bit like, is he trying to say that we'll have some divinity in us? And it's really not. It's saying that, like what you said, is that we will get closer to the nature of what God wants us to be, and to have a relationship with him that he calls us back to since the fall.
See, and that's
Yeah.
what's key about the fact that Jesus came in the flesh, one of them.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't want to take us too far off track here, but that's key. And that was one of the things that identified a so-called antichrist, denying that Jesus came in the flesh. Because Jesus was in the flesh, and he was of God, and he was God because he was the Word of God.
Hmm.
He was the same nature as God. He was it was the same divine nature.
Yeah. Yeah. John, did you have?
I was just going to suggest James chapter 1,
Okay.
verses 13 and 14, I think is sort of parallel to this.
Hmm.
Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted and with evil. Neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So, you have certainly the idea of the sinful desires,
Hmm.
or more generically, I think the word means improper desires.
Improper desires. Yeah.
That leads man to sin.
Hmm.
And if you look at Romans chapter 1, the description Paul provides of those who have turned away from God, he lists all of the deficits in society
Hmm.
that are a result of them. And so these individuals he's writing to, they are Christians, they have escaped that cesspool.
Yeah. Escape the corruption and the desire for sin. And the only way to escape is through God and your proper fellowship. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to need to move on. Did you have one more thing? Okay, let's go on to the next group. This is a really interesting group of verses. So one more reader. Well, I'll have two more. But for this middle group, verses 5 through 7, do I have a reader for that? French, go ahead.
Now, for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, and in your knowledge, self-control, and in your self-control, perseverance, and in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love.
Thank you, French. Some really beautiful verses here for chapter 2, and I made this a while back when I did this once before. I kind of like the way that these flow together in 1st and 2nd Peter. In the book, rightly so, I think there's a lot of value in looking at each one of these, you could call them virtues, and just kind of looking at how they work in your life and how they help you develop as a Christian. He'll later tell us that these need to be increasing, like moral excellence, which some translations have the word virtue, but continuing to do what is right no matter the cost. Knowledge, we've already talked about the importance of knowledge, or like Peter has talked about the importance of knowledge. He's noted the true knowledge, that which comes from God. Self-control, mastering your actions, perseverance, staying the course, and godliness, or practicing perhaps those qualities learned from God. The important part of life, we've discussed this as Peter brought this up already, and Brotherly kindness, love for the fellowship. Peter's brought this up in the first letter. And finally, love. That's binding, beautiful agent, something that, Jesus has told us is one of our commandments to do. But, rather than just kind of break down each one and talk about how they play a part in our lives, I kind of wanted to look at how Peter is bringing all of these together. Because there are a number of verses in the Bible that list virtues. There's a number of verses that list, things you ought not to be doing as well, or things that are sinful influences or behaviors. But the way that Peter draws them together is interesting. The arrows, I guess, in this diagram is what I wanted to think about tonight, because there is some variation in translations here, which I think is kind of fascinating. Also, the punctuation, which was brought up a few classes ago, most agree that there really doesn't need to be a period in this letter until you get to the end of chapter 7. Like, this whole first verse kind of flows together. I think as New King James doesn't have the period in some places that New American Standard does. There's just commas. But anyways, it's interesting. And so the variation in translations. So here we have New American Standard. It says, in your faith supply moral excellence. If it's New King James, it's add to your faith virtue. If it's NIV, it's add to your faith goodness. Or if it's ESV, it's supplement your faith with virtue. So add to, supplement, or supply. All these can be used to describe what those arrows are. But what do you all think? How are these arrows working? How are these virtues coming together? And how is Peter drawing this connection to them? How are those arrows working for you? I think there's a number of ways you can go with this. One of the harder questions I've asked, I think.
Really more than anything, it's repeated in different ways by Paul and others about development, how to develop. And a lot of it's got to do with having put their faith in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to pretty much pursue the same thing that Jesus pursued, which is ultimately, I'll just use the word charity because it's the same word. Love there is the word charity.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing that Paul described in 1 Corinthians in great detail, which, by the way, includes some of the things he just listed. But ultimately, that is the objective.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing is that it takes time, it takes work, and I always remember what Jesus said about the guy who built his house on the sand and the one who built his house on the rock.
Mm-hmm.
What did he have to do to get to the rock? He had to dig deep.
Mm-hmm.
It takes work. And what is that work? One thing is putting to death the deeds of the flesh. It's developing moral excellence. It is being virtuous, good,
Mm-hmm.
doing good things. But how do you have to, you got to, the only way to do that is to have self-control. What is that? Controlling your flesh.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to control your flesh. Do not let your flesh control you. Because what did he say about the lusts? That you have escaped that.
Mm-hmm.
You see, through the gospel, one has the power to pursue these things. Whereas when one was under sin, they did not have the power to do it. Because no matter what they did, they may try, but if they haven't put their faith in Jesus and they don't have a reason to do it, and a hope of eternal life, there's no way that they can really do it, because eventually they're going to go back to sin to fight evil. All this
Yeah.
is about becoming godlike, developing godliness, and he gives us a place to point to, and that is charity. And all these things are either part of that or things that
Yeah, I like that example. You know, the builder who built his house on the rock. And, you know, you go to, well, how did he know he was supposed to build it on the rock? Well, he had the knowledge, right? But he also probably knew that it would be easier to build it on the sand, but he had the self-control to, well, hang on, I know I need to build it on the rock, so I'm going to build it on the rock. And then it got difficult, right? So what did he need to keep going? He needed his perseverance. And so all of these things worked together within him to continue on to build the house on the rock.
You know, it's knowing what you have to do, and if you want it to last, when the storms come and the rains come,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want it washed away, then this is what you're gonna have when those times comes. Just like when these people were brought under temptation, or they were persecuted, they needed to have these in them
Mm-hmm.
to survive.
Because the storm's coming, one way or another. John, go ahead.
Well, if you look at other passages, it would argue against that these are sequential qualities.
Mm.
You need to perfect one before you work on the other. And then, perfect the next one before you work on the other. And, I think as David has indicated, these are things that you work on all of them.
Yes.
Love is not to be left to last.
Right.
Cleanliness is not to be left to last. All of these things are characteristics that you should be adding to your life.
Right. Yeah, I'm not doing perseverance yet because I'm still on self-control. Perseverance is next quarter.
Well, virtue is the manliness.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's another aspect to this that, all of these things can occur in us at once. They're all related. They're all a part of who we are. I think there's a great benefit into looking at how they feed into each other and how they work in us and finding, is there one that maybe I'm lacking at the moment, that's leading me in the wrong direction? Yeah. Was there another hand? Lorna, yeah.
It says we're to have these in order to participate in the divine nature.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these are deterrents to evil in nature.
Mm-hmm.
They give us durability. Some of them speak to direction in our life, and others speak to human relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that is covered in these things that we're to have in our life,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can be in the image of God.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it too, because it does build a very complete person,
Yeah.
all of these things. Yeah, and then if we can do all of that, it's, like you said, it goes back to that divine nature, that we have this fellowship if we can do these things, and if we can live to be what God wants us to be.
When he said Genesis, that popped in my mind, not exactly what he said, but in the beginning, God made us in his image, and we enjoyed the divine nature
Mm-hmm.
with God, a close relationship. And in that day, kings would put their image in their kingdom to show their character. And mankind was made in the image of God as he is the great king.
Mm-hmm.
As the earth and all things that he created is his territory. And we are to propagate the earth and fill it with his image. And in the beginning, they enjoyed immortality by having the tree of life,
Mm-hmm.
because they were holy. And so now, Satan comes in and evil comes in, and no longer does man have access to immortality, the tree of life, and that close relationship with God. And he works all through history to get us back here to what Peter's talking about, this complete circle, so that we can have life through our godliness and being in his image and partaking in the divine nature. So it all comes back to the beginning of Genesis.
Yeah, I landed there too. That's a really interesting place to go with that partaking of the divine nature, is that, well, we're not God. We're not God-like. We're not omnipotent. We're not divine. But we were made in God's image. And, before the fall, there was a certain, existence of Adam that we'll never really know, at least not here on earth, where, he was made good because God said he was good. He told us this, his creations were good, so Adam was good and Eve was good. And yeah, and it's interesting because the fall from that, there's just this continuous call of God wanting us to come back. From the first story of Cain and Abel, God wants us to behave properly, to have a fellowship with him, to come back to him. Yeah. Sarah.
I would just add what stands out to me also. While I think we all agree that it's not a sequential operation of perfect and move on, I think Peter does use very relational language that makes a lot of sense in how do we organize these things. Just taking, for example, the first three, I have the ESV, I like how it states it, with the repeated phrase of supplement your X with Y, and supplement your Y with Z, etc. If you think about it, each supplementing another, you supplement your faith with virtue. Okay, I think that's important because you can build to do that. You can have a squishy, empty bubble of faith. I think that would be described as a faith without works is a dead faith. So you supplement your faith with virtue, but then what are these virtues? Well, you need to supplement that with knowledge. You have a lot of people in the world trying to do things they perceive as good, but acting without, the knowledge of God and what he says is good. So I think the relational aspect still plays a very interesting role in how we can supplement one with another. Not in order, but all simultaneously the way they play together.
Yeah, I think it is important, like you said, to look at that relationship that there is between them, and that if you kind of drop one, you can make some serious errors in your life. If you just drop knowledge and have faith and try to do good without knowing what is good and what is not good, you'll have some real problems in life. You probably aren't going to get the good quite right. And yeah, the way that they supplement each other is very important because all of them work together. Yeah.
And that's the whole reason that Jesus pointed out, and probably some of the other writers, as well as Paul, it's all fulfilled in the two commandments. That you love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if I make every decision based upon those two commandments, before I do something, when something pops into my head, and I decide, well, A, is this something God would like? Well, I might think it is, but B, how does it affect my neighbor? You see how that works? It actually can be a little bit simpler when we start to look at things according to that law, and that's what they're saying. When you judge something, that is the law that Jesus brought, that in covenant, and our attitude towards other people has to change. But if our flesh is what's motivating us, it may decide, well, that's not good for me. But what does they say? You got to do what's good for others. And if that means, even if it's something like eating meat sacrificed to idols, and I know I can do it, I may have to just say, well, I know I can do it, but I don't want my brother to stumble. That was his whole point. And there's a lot of things that we can do in this life to develop charity, that if we search within ourselves, when we question, why are we doing this? Why do I even want to do this? Is it coming from God, a knowledge of God? Or is it coming from what my flesh wants? And maybe it falls into the category of being arrogant, boastful, or
Mm-hmm.
And if I do this, it's probably going to have an adverse effect on somebody else in one way or another. I hope that makes sense.
It does, if you talk about our motivations and, what's at war within us to act, and are we acting in love? Are we acting in self-interest? And, it's the kind of fight with those things, and the battle, I guess you could say, internally that can occur. Peter is certainly talking about those themes and how they work within us as Christians. Yeah. Yeah, other thoughts on this before we go to the next one? John, I'll give you the last
I
word.
just wanted to make sure we keep a link back to the previous verses that we were looking at,
Yeah.
where he had described that they had become partakers of the divine nature and
Mhm.
escaped corruption that is in the world. What is the divine nature? And I think this relates to the divine nature that they're supposed to be putting on.
Mm-hmm. Because if we do all these things, because Peter's telling us what this is that ought to be in our heads as we want to be a partaker of the divine nature.
And this is
How?
how we escape the cesspool of war.
Yeah. How are we going to go about doing that? A lot of work. Yeah, go ahead.
There are rumors that God is a golf fan.
There's rumors that God is a golf
Yes,
fan.
because it says partakers of the divine nature.
Good one. I did not see that coming. Anybody else with a dad joke, you're welcome to bring it in. Hand up back? No. Okay, just checking. Okay, one more reader, just 2 verses left. Can I have a reader? 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. Cortland.
For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins.
So again, the true knowledge comes up. We don't want to be useless, unfruitful, blind, short-sighted. Even if we have the true knowledge, we have to know how to act and what to do with it. So, increase all these qualities. It's starting to sound a little bit intimidating. A number of verses come to mind here, when I think about what all of this means and what bringing all of this together in these verses. And I just thought I'd look at some of those because, well, when you read this a couple of times, there are some harsh words there. Useless, unfruitful, blind or short-sighted, both of which involve eye trouble, but neither one desirable. But, in life, you don't want to be described as that by someone like Peter. And there are some harsh words, and I know that in this book, in this letter, we'll be talking about false prophets eventually, and Christ himself had a lot of harsh words for false prophets as well. So, this brought to mind for me Hebrews 3. I'll start reading in verse 12. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day to day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. So from Hebrews and to this, we see an interesting parallel. The dangers of falling away, what it means to be partakers of the divine nature, partakers of the good, and how to help each other not fall away. The importance of brotherly assistance, you could call it, or kindness, to help do what? Increase these qualities and continue to increase them. Also came to mind for me is John chapter 3. Verse 29. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom stands and listens for him, and is overjoyed to hear the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must increase, and I must decrease. So the thought of increasing brings up these verses for me, because he will increase as I decrease. The idea of the divine nature, getting closer to it, the fellowship with God, as all these things increase. The other verse on putting off the former self came to mind. Those things will decrease. The lusts of this world, the desire for sin, all of these things will decrease. So I don't have one of those discussion questions with this. I just wanted to dwell on this, kind of closing out what we've learned about tonight and what we read from the verses. There are study questions after this, but any other comments on this before we go into the book study questions? Sarah.
I don't know how to describe each verse, but a little scary, maybe I would say. I like the reading of the ESV here, rather than render you neither useless, it says keep you from being useless and unfruitful. And so, what it sounds like to me, there's two qualifications. You need these qualities, and they need to be increasing.
Mm-hmm.
They can't even be stable. They need to be increasing. And our default state sounds like useless and unfruitful. If you're not doing that, you're useless and unfruitful. Having these and increasing them keep you from being useless and unfruitful, and that is a constant state of moving forward. So there's no real resting place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can't sort of tread water in place and be useless, and be fruitful. You have to always be progressing to stay out of that useless and unfruitful state.
Yeah, it becomes even more intimidating now, because not only do I have to increase all of those, there's a consequence to not increasing them. It's going the other way. John and then Bethany.
I didn't have.
Oh, I thought I saw your hand. Must be the backpack behind you. Bethany, go ahead.
The word render has interesting meaning for me personally, because I usually connect it to processing animal fats.
Hmm.
Once you purify the fat, what you have left over is what you call the renderings. And that's whatever gristle or pieces that were impure or without use.
Hmm.
So I love how this verse kind of just illustrates the complete removal of the useless bits and making forward of usefulness and fruitfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting to think about it that way, because it's like you're going to process in one way or the other, and you'll process towards the useless part if you don't increase and continue to move towards the purity part. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Other thoughts? Sarah? Anything more? Yeah.
This one has a lot of visual stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I like the ESV reading of verse 9, where it says, "You're so nearsighted as to be blind." And I think that's very specific. Right? You're not farsighted. You're not seeing out. You're so nearsighted, right? You can't see anything. You can't see farther than your nose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very much where we are. We're only self-focused, and it's blinded us if we aren't focusing on these enriching qualities that lead us through.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, that I forget where that came up for me before, but I often look at that when there's a comparison verse between doing what is, in line with God's teaching and not, and that it's sometimes like a short-term and a long-term thinking. Not always, but sometimes it brings that up for me, is that if you're looking in the long term, the most long term you can look is being in heaven, but there's even other incremental long-term effects of your actions that you can look at that will affect how you act. And if you're just looking one step ahead, your actions will likely be short-sighted. Like you're just going to do whatever helps you in the moment. But if you're seeing years down the road, you know, if you're seeing people develop and you're seeing relationships develop, your actions change dramatically. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all for comments. I'm happy that we don't get to the study questions because the study questions are kind of hit or miss for me, and that means we have a lot to talk about. So good job, everybody.
That
Yeah.
one thing I have found very interesting about this is that Second Peter is one of the most disputed books in the Bible, and it says you must either accept it or reject it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of odd to me.
Yeah, and you know, I was going to get into a little bit of that next week because there's an interesting verse in there. No, this is a good segue. But there's some interesting verses in there that about, you know, people that debate whether or not Peter's the author. And I think there's some verses next week that, or at least one in particular, that really point to Peter is the author. And, you know, this is certainly a letter we need to be concerned about as Christians. And I believe it belongs here for sure. But yeah, the fact that it's disputed is, you know, it's interesting. It's worth addressing. Yeah.